Mega Man 5 for Game Boy. And with Super Game Boy compatibility, which means you get a fancy border and some mild color choices. It's better than nothing. Anyway, released in 1994, and basically the final Mega Man title to grace the vintage Game Boy, Mega Man 5 is perhaps the most ambitious of the Game Boy line? No, perhaps ambitious is too strong a term, but it does feel fresh compared to its predecessors, as the game gives you 8 new Robot Masters, or Star Droids as they're called, to contend with, replaces your Mega Buster Charge Shot with a new Mega Arm weapon, and finally gives you a new attack kitty called Tango. Because when I think of a killer cat, I think Tango. In any event, Mega Man 5 follows the same format as the previous titles. You start with 4 robots to choose from, you fight through their levels and beat them to claim their powers. Then you play a short interlude level before taking on the second set of 4 robots before challenging the leader of the Star Droids known as Terra. Then you play a quick shmup level on your way to Dr. Wily's Death Star, rematch with the Mega Man killers of the previous games, and then face off against Dr. Wily himself in the final battle of— oh, who am I kidding? You'll both face off against each other again soon enough, it's only a matter of time for Pete's sake. And because it was such a wonderful feature the last time, the shop mechanic from Mega Man 4 makes a return, where you could spend the P-chips you collect on various items like extra lives, energy tanks, and things of that nature. Like the previous game, you attain Rush Coil and Rush Jet after defeating certain bosses, and if you look hard enough, you'll come across Proto Man who will leave behind some helpful items that will give you a leg up on the competition. Now, all of that is familiar territory if you've played a Mega Man game, and especially the last game. But what is new territory in Mega Man 5, aside from the new robot bosses and levels, are 2 new items that you start with: the Mega Arm and Tango the Cat original character Do Not Steal. The Mega Arm is essentially your new Charge Shot. Despite being presented as a replacement for your Mega Buster, you still have the old pellet shots, and there's still the old pellet shots that pew pew pew. Press and hold B to charge up, and when you let go, you'll launch your fist at a distance and strike enemies hard. The time you charge up determines how far your fist flies, and while it's airborne, you're pretty much defenseless until it reattaches itself, so learning to use the Mega Arm effectively is not a bad idea. Eventually, you can purchase 2 upgrades that can respectively grab pickups from a distance and hit enemies multiple times. In addition to the Mega Arm, you also start with a new companion called Tango. With Tango selected, press and hold B for a short while to summon Tango, at which point he, she, it, whatever will show up, bounce around, and strike at the nearest enemy. Tango's not bad for a crutch and proves useful in certain situations, but is no substitute for Beat the Attack Bird original character Do Not Steal. Oh, and there's also this other item that you could get by finding these 4 crystals in the latter half of the game. It's basically a gimmick that reduces your weapon usage by half, which is useful especially in the final stages. So Mega Man 5 has new stuff. It has a new fist weapon, it has a new animal companion, it has the new bosses, it has new weapons, it has a space shooter bit, it has rematches with bosses from the previous 4 games, it even has its own devil boss type thing, and people like to call this the best of the Game Boy bunch. And you know what? I could almost buy into it, but honestly, I'm split between 4 and 5. There are bits that 4 does better, and then there are bits that 5 does better, but really, who cares? Both are great games. Only thing 5 has over 4 is brand new toys to play with, and this is perhaps where the game can falter somewhat depending on your very subjective mileage. Mega Arm's a neat little gimmick that's different from the usual Mega Buster, but not by much. Once you get all the upgrades, it probably reaches its full potential and can be fun to use at times. Tango the Cat is basically a grounded Beat the Bird, somewhat useful and destructive in some cases, but in other cases, I'm longing for a swooping attack bird bot thing that loses energy when it hits things and not constantly as it's on screen. The bosses are interesting in some regard, but not quite as imposing as past robots in past games. And while you have neat weapons such as the Break Dash, the Spark Chaser, and the Mercury thing, you also have less than stellar weapons like Saltwater, Photon Missiles, and Black Hole 1.0. Stuff that only sees uses in boss fights and probably not that effective in that regard either. On the flip side, Mega Man 5 plays about as well as a traditional Mega Man adventure would play, and as such, gameplay is pretty solid stuff with tight and responsive controls to boot. The game does have some minor bouts of slowdown, but it doesn't seem as heavily prevalent as past games have been, and that's a good thing. Level variety is a bit lacking, however. You have a couple little gimmicks here and there, such as gravity and springboard bubble things, but other than that, Not that exciting seeing a bunch of interiors, but hey, if nothing else, the overall challenge is pretty fair, and that space shooter segment is pretty neat. Mega Man 5 is the first game in the Game Boy line to feature additional functionality when played on the Super Game Boy adapter, which basically means a fancy new background and some custom color palettes for each of the game's multiple stages. I like the additional touch with the full color HUD on the bottom where the health meter and Mega Man head almost looks NES quality. Aside from that, Mega Man 5's pretty standard quality stuff at this point. While there's a bunch of new stuff, it's pretty much done in the same style as the previous games, and it's not bad, it's alright. The space theme does limit the visual variety a bit. All the stages are pretty dull looking interiors and not much fun stuff, but it looks fun regardless, so whatever. At this point, the graphics are pretty standard fare with nothing really sticking out, and the cutscenes aren't quite as exciting as the previous game, but on a whole, no complaint, it looks like Mega Man. That's all I could ever ask for. Sound-wise, we have a whole new selection of musical bits to go along with the new Robot Master things, and it's okay. There's probably only a couple standout tunes. The Wily bass theme is neat, foreboding. The space theme isn't too bad for the shmup level. And then the rest of it dwindles somewhere between above average fare and somewhat forgettable fluff. The boss theme also gives me a bit of a headache. Sound effects are the same as before. They're okay, not much more than that. It's funny how the previous entries only had a couple original tunes that stood out and were really good because the rest of the tracks in those games were recycled from the NES titles, but in a game full of original tunes, only a minute number of them were truly top-notch. Still, the overall sound quality is okay, not terrible, and also nothing really special. As the final game in the Game Boy line, Mega Man 5 brings this sub-series to a close with a pretty strong showing, maintaining the core elements of the series' trademark gameplay while introducing some new enemies and bosses to confront, as well as adding a bit more polish. What you have here is a pretty solid entry that has more than enough good points to it that one could easily claim it to be one of the series' finest entries. Like I said before, in that regard, I'm split between 4 and 5 as each has their own strengths and high points that could claim that particular title, but that's only if you care for that sort of thing, and honestly, both games are the best in the line of games that are genuinely fun to play, and yes, that includes the somewhat undercooked second game in the Game Boy line. All that aside, Mega Man 5 is a damn fine game and definitely one worth checking out if you hadn't had the chance. And while the original card commands a rather high price, you could get it off the 3DS Virtual Console, so there is a cheaper alternative if you want to go that route. Either way, this is good stuff all around, and that's just dandy. Yeah, that's all I got. Good night.